My office was quiet in those days, the kind of quiet that comes from certainty. I'd look out over the city from that window, Margaret's photograph on the desk, my father's old Bible in the drawer, and I believed in the machine I helped build. I'd sent men to death row, and I still think about every one of them. But I believed the process was sound. The weight of that responsibility was a burden I carried with a kind of solemn pride. My son, James Jr., was starting law school then, talking about following in my footsteps. I told him, "Let me tell you what it takes to prosecute a murder case. It takes an unshakable faith in the facts." Then the file landed on my desk. A brutal homicide, a young woman. The crime scene photos were a horror, and they had him, a man named Michael. His prints were there. A neighbor said she'd heard arguing. The forensic report, it was like gospel to us. We weren't finding truth, we were building a case, a solid one. I remember thinking of that victim's family, the closure they deserved. Justice for victims wasn't just a slogan to me, it was the reason I put on the suit every morning. The trial was a formality. We presented our puzzle piece by piece, the science, the witness. Michael's court-appointed lawyer did what he could, but the tide was against him. When the jury came back with a guilty verdict, I felt that old, grim satisfaction. Another dangerous man off the streets. I slept soundly in my own bed that night. I didn't think of him again, not really, for 22 years. Not until a law student, her voice trembling with a conviction I recognized from my own youth, called my office. She had questions. She'd found the case file. She said the science was junk. She said the witness had recanted, said we'd coerced him. I was furious at first. How dare she? I reviewed the file myself late at night under the lamp in my study, and piece by piece my certainty crumbled. The weight that settled on me wasn't pride anymore. It was shame. I went to the prison. Not as the district attorney, but as a man carrying a debt. He sat across from me, this ghost of the young man in the mugshot. He didn't shout, he just looked tired. "They all gave up on me," he said. "Everyone had. I figured you had too." I hadn't, not anymore, but my faith had put him there. We fought for 3 more years. My own colleagues thought I'd lost my mind. My daughter Elizabeth, a victim's advocate, couldn't look at me for a month. But we got the exoneration. I stood in the back of the courtroom when the judge said the words. He walked out into a sunlight he hadn't seen in a quarter of a century, bewildered, and I watched from the shadows. My apology can't erase the sound of that cell door. It can't give him back his life. If a man like me, with a minister for a father and a heart for justice, can get it so terribly wrong, then it is happening right now to someone waiting for a person who hasn't given up. The trial was a formality, but we treated it like a sacrament. We were the high priests of justice, and we presented our evidence like scripture. Let me tell you what it takes to prosecute a murder case. It takes an unshakable faith in the facts, and we had them. The forensic report on the stand, it was our gospel. The expert explained the fingerprint match with a calm, technical certainty that made the jury nod along. I can still see his hands pointing to the blown-up photographs. It was science. It was truth. Or so we all believed. The neighbor's testimony was the human heart of it. A frail woman, clutching her handkerchief, voice trembling as she described the arguing she'd heard. I guided her gently, A Southern gentleman helping a lady tell a difficult story. I never raised my voice. I didn't have to. The implication of what she'd heard was damning enough. I believed her. We all did. His lawyer, he did what he could. A public defender with a stack of files on his table. He pointed out inconsistencies, but they sounded like technicalities against the tide of our narrative. When he suggested the police work was sloppy, I objected. I called it an affront to the hard-working men and women in blue. The judge sustained it. I could see the jury's faces tighten. They were with us. My closing argument wasn't fiery. It was solemn. I talked about the weight of responsibility. I talked about the young woman whose life was stolen. I looked at those 12 people and I said, justice for victims isn't a slogan, it's a promise. And today you are the keepers of that promise. I believed every word. The jury was out for less than a day. When they filed back in, their faces were averted. They wouldn't look at him, not one of them. That's when you know. The foreman stood. Guilty. The word didn't echo. It just settled, heavy and final in the quiet room. I didn't look at Michael then. I looked at the victim's family, saw the relief break over them like a wave. That was my grim satisfaction. That was my purpose. Sentencing was a week later. The judge asked if he had anything to say. He stood, those cheap prison clothes hanging on him, and he just said, I didn't do this. It was quiet, hollow, already defeated. The judge gave him life. The gavel sounded like a cell door slamming shut. They put the cuffs on him right there in the well of the courtroom. The metallic click-click was the loudest sound in the world. He turned, shuffling, the chain between his ankles whispering against the floor. And as they led him out the side door, he looked back, just once. Not at me, not at the judge. He looked at the main doors, at the daylight streaming in from the free world he was leaving. That was the last glimpse. Then he was gone, consumed by the system I'd so faithfully served. I packed my briefcase. I shook hands with the detectives. I went home to Margaret and told her we'd gotten justice. I slept soundly. For 22 years, I carried that day not as a nightmare, but as a duty done. For 22 years, Michael was gone. To me, to the world. Just a number in a file I'd closed. But in a cell upstate, he was living a life I'd built for him. Let me tell you what that life is. It's a concrete box. It's a routine so precise you can mark the years by the peeling paint on the wall. It's the sound of keys and gates and men who've given up. He refused to join them. He fought from inside. Wrote letters to anyone who'd listen. The Innocence Project, journalists, his old overworked public defender. Most came back unopened or not at all. They tell you to admit guilt to get parole, to show remorse. He wouldn't say the words. Maintaining your innocence in there, it's a different kind of sentence. They call you stubborn, a liar to the end. It isolates you more than the walls ever could. I learned he got married. A pen pal, a woman from a church group who believed him. They had a wedding in the visitation room with a plastic chair for an altar. She became his lifeline, his advocate. She's the one who kept the file alive, who pestered law students, who never let it rest. While I was giving speeches about finality, she was fighting for a new beginning. His children grew up visiting a man in a jumpsuit. They knew him through glass, their small hands pressed against the partition. He missed first steps, school plays, proms. He watched his family age in plastic chairs, the world moving on without him while he stood still. And then a crack, a tiny one. A law student, digging through old evidence logs for a class project, found a discrepancy. A piece of the victim's clothing, logged into evidence but never tested. New DNA techniques existed now. The student took it to a professor who took it to a nonprofit. It was a thread, a single fragile thread. They filed a motion, a request for testing. It was denied. They filed another. It was a process measured in years in bureaucratic rejections. But they kept pulling on that thread. I knew none of this. I was retired by then, giving talks, enjoying grandchildren. The case was a footnote in my career, a duty done. But upstate, in that cell, a man who'd been told to give up hope for 2 decades, he felt something shift. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't even close. But after 22 years of silence, someone was listening. And that changes everything. The motion was granted. That's the phrase. Dry, legal. It doesn't sound like thunder, but it was. After 23 years, a judge ordered the DNA test. I read about it in the paper, not on the front page, mind you, buried in the Metro section. Inmate seeks new testing in 95 murder. I remember putting my coffee down. My hand was steady, but something in my chest wasn't. Margaret asked what was wrong. I just shook my head. The results took months. I told myself it was a formality. The science had advanced, yes, but science confirms truth. It doesn't invent it. I'd built my case on evidence. I believed in it. I had to. The call came on a Tuesday morning. It was from a young reporter. She asked for my comment on the exoneration of Michael Ridley. I didn't know the name at first. Then she said the case, the year, the victim, and the world tilted. Just a few degrees, enough for everything to slide. I sat in my study, in the quiet house, and I listened as she told me. The DNA from that clothing, it matched a man who was already in prison for 2 other murders committed in the same way, in the same neighborhood, 6 months later. A man my office had never considered, a man I'd never known existed. I've sent men to death row, and I still think about every one of them. But this was different. This was a failure of a different magnitude. The system I'd served, the process I'd trusted, the work of my own hands. It had taken an innocent man and buried him alive for 23 years, and I was the one who'd handed them the shovel. I didn't go to the courthouse the day they vacated the sentence. I couldn't. But I saw the pictures. Michael standing between his wife and that law student, now a lawyer herself. He was wearing a suit that didn't quite fit. His face wasn't jubilant. It was stunned, like a man who'd been holding his breath at the bottom of the ocean and had just broken the surface. You don't cheer. You just gasp. Freedom isn't a switch you flip. They opened the gate, but the walls, he carried those out with him. The world had become a loud, bright, terrifying place. Simple things were a struggle. A menu with too many choices, the noise of traffic, the feel of rain on his skin. He hadn't felt rain in 23 years. He'd missed the entire digital revolution. A cell phone was a foreign object. His children were adults, with lives he'd witnessed through glass. How do you become a father when you've only ever been a prisoner? The state gave him money, a sum calculated by some formula. It sounds significant until you divide it by the days, by the birthdays, the Christmases, the ordinary Tuesday nights he lost. It doesn't buy back a single one. It doesn't repair the trust in the institutions that are supposed to protect you. It's an apology written on a check, and it bounces. I reached out. It took me a month to find the courage. I wrote him a letter. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I had no right to that. I just told him who I was and that I was sorry. For my part in it, for every day. He wrote back, a short note. He said he'd thought about me often over the years. He said he accepted my apology. The grace in that, it humbled me in a way I didn't know was possible. We've met for coffee since. It's not friendship. It's something else. A reckoning. We sit at the same table, two old men, one who had all the power and one who had none. And we talk about the weather and our families and the crushing weight of what was lost. The system I believed in is broken in places I never saw. It's built on finality, on closing files. We celebrate convictions. We rarely, if ever, look back. But if we are about justice, true justice, then we must be willing to look back. We must fund conviction integrity units. We must preserve evidence and test it when new questions arise. We must stop seeing post-conviction claims as an annoyance and start seeing them as a duty. Because Michael is not the only one. There are innocent people still inside, right now. Men and women who have given up hope because the world has given up on them. They are living the life I built for Michael. Their voices are whispers against concrete. We have to learn to listen. So let me tell you what I've learned. The moral authority in this conversation no longer rests with the prosecutors or the judges or the police. It rests with the exonerated. It rests with men like Michael, who have paid a price none of us can imagine for a crime they did not commit. Their voice, their experience, their unbearable clarity about what we got wrong, that is the compass we need now. We must have the courage to follow it, however uncomfortable it leads us, however much it asks us to question our own work. The pursuit of truth doesn't end with a verdict. It only ends when every last innocent person is free, and that is a duty we all share.